One horrible thing about COVID-19 is how helpless it can make you feel. It's this invisible enemy impacting the entire world, and the solution seems so complicated. Yet we all tried to help. Think about it. When lockdown hit, what did you do? Some of us went and got groceries for elderly neighbors. We checked in with loved ones, gave more to charities, upended our social lives so that we could socially distance. Across Toronto, we saw tremendous examples of sacrifice and solidarity. But the truth is, some folks sacrificed more than others. Frontline workers, the elderly, low-income workers, Black, Indigenous, and racialized residents. As the saying goes, we were in the same storm, but we certainly were not in the same boat. COVID-19 has helped us to see how truly unequal our society has become. It has many of you asking, okay, well, how can I as an individual help us to build back better? These social issues, which were, maybe not clear before, but I see so clearly now, how can I help make a change? I've spent most of my adult life thinking about social change. As a student activist, as a researcher, as the founder of a charity, and today, in my work advising major institutions. And as I've thought about it, I think I have an answer to that question. What can I, as an individual, do to help change society? And the answer is this: nothing. There is nothing you as an individual can do to change society. Retweeting statements, self-educating yourself, becoming an ethical consumer, these are all good things. But history has shown that well-meaning, isolated individual actions do not change how society functions. The only thing that changes society is when individuals come together as communities, and those communities contest and transform power relations. So let me back up. What do I mean by that? When I say communities, I mean it in the broadest sense. Groups of friends, neighborhood associations, workplaces, faith groups, those are all communities. And when I'm talking about power, I mean social power, the ability to determine how money's spent, how resources are allocated, to write and rewrite laws and regulations. Myself, I learned about the power of communities to transform society back in 2005. I was a student at the University of Toronto and president of the Black Students Association. That year, 2005, was the year of the gun. And it was this horrible time where every day you'd open up the paper and look at it, and it seemed like one after the other, faces of young Black men and women who'd lost their lives to gun violence. And on top of it, there was this toxic rhetoric in the media talking about Black youth like this foreign species who had invaded Toronto with gangs and violence. I wanted to do something, but on my own, I just didn't know how. So I reached out to other student leaders, and we created an advocacy coalition, and we launched a campaign called Bling, Bring Love In, Not Guns. And we had a very simple message with Bling. The answer to what was happening in the city was not more police and not more jails, but real investments in youth, creating job opportunities, ending systemic racism. And Black youth were not the problem, but the answer. We needed a seat at the table and help determining the response. We ended up taking that message to anyone who'd listen. We did high school outreach, we did events, we sat down with politicians. We took the message all the way to Parliament Hill, where I got to present it for then Prime Minister Paul Martin. I learned from that the fact that a small community, there was just 10 of us meeting every night, could impact thousands and shift a national conversation. But why is it? Why is it that communities can achieve things no individual can? I gotta say, it's not just about the power of numbers. The fact is, communities provide us with psychological safety. We're braver together. Now, after Bing, I got to travel all over the world and connect with different activists, whether it was township organizers in Cape Town, South Africa, or climate change organizers in London, England, or everyday heroes here in Toronto. One of those heroes was a man named Jim Kirkwood. Now, unfortunately, Jim recently passed. He was a United Church minister, retired. I met him when he was in his 80s. And you could still see Jim, up to the last few months of his life, with his walker, going to rallies and protests, fighting the good fight. I connected with Jim because my PhD thesis looked at the Canadian role in the global movement to end apartheid in South Africa. And I remember one night, I was talking to Jim, and he said to me, he said, "Kofi, when we started this work in the 1970s, it was hard. It was difficult. Most people still saw Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. The South African government, to many, was seen as a Cold War ally. On my own, I would have given up. I couldn't have kept going." But he said, "Kofi, hope lives in community. And so what I had to do is find folks who shared my values, grab them, hold them close, and for 20 years, we gave each other the strength to continue on." And you look at the history. In the 1970s, hundreds of Canadians like Jim began to organize around this cause and slowly try to change public opinion. They were so successful that by the 1980s, you could get 10,000 people marching on Queen's Park in Toronto, chanting "Free Mandela," while at the same time, real action was happening in this country about sanctions. But as I said, we have to remember the actions of communities only change society when they shift power, when that money is spent differently, when the resources are reallocated, when those laws get rewritten. That is the reason so many of us are honestly cynical about the statements we've heard from major corporations around the Black Lives Matter movement. Fact is, even Fruit by the Foot had a pro-BLM statement. And many of us are still asking, okay, great, but is power going to change? Just like the NBA players in the bubble this summer, there came a point where they said, well, are our group statements and the slogans on the back of our jerseys really accomplishing change? So should all of us who are doing collective work look critically at our actions and say, is this truly impacting power? I learned about that founding a charity called the C Center for Young Black Professionals. And I founded it with a woman named Shireen Ashman. Over the years, C has helped hundreds of youth move from crisis to stability. I still have a letter in my drawer from one of the first young people who went through the program. And he wrote me years later, talking about how he was on a dark path in life, and going to C led to him going back to school, getting a job, getting married, and buying a home that he'd just purchased. Charity work saves lives. There's no denying that. But at the same time, we saw at C, for every young person we helped, there were hundreds more we didn't have capacity to reach. Also, we could help young people to be the best workers possible, give them the skills, give them the self-confidence, but if the economy was not creating decent work for youth, if the job sites they were going to were still sexist and racist and stereotypical towards them, then it was not enough. Charity work saves lives, but no charitable program can fix a broken system. So what did we do? Well, we elevated our work to start impacting power. So today, a core part of what C does is work with politicians, engage with social movements, and sit down with employers to try to reform the system. But there's one more thing I want to say about power, and that's the fact that power responds to pressure. All throughout history, the major social changes we've seen, many that are common sense today, happened because of pressure, and those with power resisted the change. Think about it. If we're thinking about a minimum wage for workers, or a publicly funded healthcare system, or ending support for a racist government in South Africa. All of those changes were possible because groups of everyday Canadians came together in communities and they contested and shifted power on the issues. So what does that mean? Well, that means sometimes to do this work, you have to get political. And sometimes there will be struggle, and people with power will push back. You'll upset people. But that, my friends, is what the late Congressman John Lewis called getting into good trouble. But good trouble is hard, and that's why we have to do it together. So back to my original question. How can an individual help us to build back better from COVID-19? Well, if you're feeling even slightly inspired right now, I'd like you to dream with me for a minute, because there's 3 things you can do. The first, you need to pick a cause, right? You need to think about something you'd like to see change in society. The second, you need to find a community. Now, you could go out and create your own group, but you're already part of communities at this moment in time. Jim Kirkwood, who I talked about, his community that he used was the United Church. Myself and the activists from the Bling campaign, it was the University of Toronto. Neither of those organizations were created specifically to fight those causes, but they all had money, they had access to buildings, and they had deep networks. And with a little bit of internal advocacy, those resources could be repurposed towards the cause. That's like the oldest trick in the activist book. So I ask you, think about it. Is there a community where you could do that? Then the third and final thing. You want to follow the advice of Saul Alinsky here. You want to find an easy and early win. One simple victory where you can make a small shift in power. But through achieving it, you can build up the confidence of your people. Others will join in, and then from there, the work will snowball. Choose a cause, find a community, and start with an early and easy victory. That, my friends, is how individuals help us to build back better from COVID-19. But let's be honest, right? Let's be honest. COVID is not the only issue that's going to test us. Climate change, racism and xenophobia, our insane income inequality, all of these issues will continue to test us. But when we come together as communities to transform power, we can impact and change all of these issues. My friends, it's possible to raise out of the despair and anguish of COVID through one change here, one change there, with one thread and another, weave a tapestry of a new society, a new social contract, a new Toronto, a new Canada that is more equitable, more sustainable, and more resilient than what came before. We can do it, my friends, together.